morning, Juniors. I hope you're doing well. Still in Washington State, and today it's overcast and it's cloudy and it's breezy and it's cool. But I hear that in Alabama, the weather is perfect. Nice and warm, nice and sunny. So there you go. But isn't it neat that we live in such a big country that there's wide differences? There are dogwoods here, because I have seen some. There are azaleas here, because I've seen some. But the colors of the azaleas are totally different than what we have there in Alabama. Yeah, there's pink, but there's orange. I've seen kind of like a purpley one. Just very interesting. Very interesting. Again, we live in such a wide, big country that we can have all this diversity within our country. And of course, God gave us all this diversity. And so we need to be thankful to Him. I'm whispering because the babies are still asleep and I don't want to wake them up yet. So I'm going to try to get through this recording without waking them up. Have you ever had something bad happen to you that really wasn't your fault? For example, like Daniel. What did Daniel do wrong that caused him to be in the lion's den? He prayed, right? So he really didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't Daniel's fault. But we know how the story ends, and we also know that Daniel gave all the glory to God, right? When he was saved by the lions, he didn't say, oh, it was me that closed the mouths of the lions. He said, it is God. And remember, Darius said, Daniel, has your God saved you? So that's just one example in the Bible of how something happened to them, and it wasn't their fault, but something wonderful happened in return. Can you think of another one? What about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego? Or Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, right? What did they do wrong? Wrong. They prayed, but they wouldn't bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. What happened to them? They ended up in the fiery pit, right? The fiery furnace. And we know what happened there. And instead of the 3 men being in the fiery furnace, there were 4 men. So Jesus was with them. And they, at the end, got to say, this is because God saved us. Jesus was with us. God saved us. So they gave all the glory to God. So today's Bible story is another example how somebody gets caught up in some circumstances that really wasn't their fault. And it could have been really bad. It could have ended up really bad. But because they gave all the glory to God, it worked out wonderful. Our memory verse lesson is Mark 9:35. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. Anybody that wants to be first will be last and will be the servant. And this is part of the story where Jesus is talking to the 12 disciples, because the 12 disciples had been squabbling with each other about who was the best disciple, who was the most important disciple, who was the greatest disciple. And Jesus is telling them, you don't understand. Whoever is first has to be least, right? So that's the Bible verse. So our story is in Acts. Remember, that's the acts of the people who love, the actions of the people who love God. It starts off with the 12 apostles, right? But then we find other people in the book of Acts. It's the actions of the people that loved God. So here we go. We're in Acts 28, verse 1 through 10. When they had safely been brought through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. So here's Paul. He's been shipwrecked. You know, that happened to Paul a lot. He got shipwrecked a lot. So here he is again, getting shipwrecked. The natives, the people on the island, showed us extraordinary kindness. Because of the rain that had set in, because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on a fire, a viper came out of the heat and fastened itself on Paul's hand. Now, if that was me, I would have freaked out and probably died right there. When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer. And though he has been saved from the sea, justice is not going to allow him to live." However, Paul shook the creature off his hand into the fire, and he came to no harm. But they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. Because remember, these are the native peoples. They live on this island of Malta. They know what happens when those vipers bite you. But after they had waited a long time and saw that nothing unusual was happening, they changed their minds and began to say he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Plebeius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Plebeius was lying in bed afflicted with a recurrent fever and dysentery. Do you know what dysentery is? Really bad diarrhea. Really, really bad. And Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. Did Paul really heal him? No, of course not. After this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to Paul and getting cured. They also honored us in many ways of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. Paul was on this island of Malta for about 3 months, and he was shipwrecked. Then he get bit by a viper. So all these things are happening to Paul. He didn't cause any of them to happen. So all these things are happening to Paul, and he gives glory to God. And because he gives glory to God, more and more people of Malta are hearing about God, right? Paul could have said, "Oh, here I am, shipwrecked again. This is not fair. I'm not a sailor. What's going on here?" But that's not what he did, is it? That's not what he did. He said, "God has saved me again. What does God want me to do?" When the snake bit him, when the viper bit him, he could have said, "Oh, all I was trying to do was put some firewood on the fire so that we can all stay warm. And this snake has come and bit me. Poor me." But that's not what Paul did. He shook it off into the fire, and the people of Malta were like, "Okay, he's going to die." And they were watching him, and they were watching him, and they were watching him, and he didn't die. So he was able to give glory to God, and more people of Malta heard about God. And then the man that was over the island of Malta, Plebeius, I guess I'm saying his name right, his dad was really, really sick, right? So he asks Paul to go and take care of his dad just to see if there's anything he could do. Paul prayed, and the man was healed. So now Paul is talking to the main person of Malta, right? Isn't that amazing? Paul was a servant of God. Paul allowed God to use him in every single way, right? We should be servants of God. When stuff happens to us that we didn't cause, things happen to us that we didn't have any control over, we still need to be servants of God, right? And that goes back to our memory verse, where Mark 9:35. Went too far. Mark 9:35. Sitting down with them, this is Jesus, sitting down with them, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he needs to be last. He needs to be a servant," right? Isn't that awesome? Jesus could have chosen Peter, James, or John, because those are the 3 we hear the most about, to be the best disciple, to be the number 1 disciple. But that's not what Jesus' purpose was here on earth, was it? He wasn't to choose the people who were the number 1, the number 2, the number 3 people, right? He was here to save us all. So if Jesus is number 1, didn't Jesus really become the least? Didn't Jesus really become the lowest? Because he died on the cross as a sinner. Had Jesus done anything wrong? No. No, he hadn't. But Jesus used his circumstances to the glory of God, right? And God raised him 3 days later. So how many more people got to hear about Jesus because Jesus died on the cross and rose 3 days later and ultimately went back to heaven? Here we are 2,000 years later, still talking about Jesus. Isn't that wonderful? And we're never going to stop talking about Jesus. We're not. Our next verse is Galatians 5:14. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This whole idea of I'm not the best, I'm not the top, I'm not number one, my neighbor. How can God use me to help my neighbor? How can God use me to be a witness to my neighbor, right? Let's look at Matthew 25:40. And the king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of my brothers, even to the least of them, you've done it to me. Even if you've done it to the least of them, you've done it to Jesus, right? Because Jesus made everybody on earth. Did he make some people more important than others? No, of course not. We're all equal, aren't we? So when we take care of our neighbor, be it somebody we do know, somebody we don't know, we're still taking care of Jesus. We're doing what he's asked us to do, right? And so we can use whatever circumstances that you find yourself in to the glory of God. Isn't that amazing? It really is. When I stop and think about things in my life that maybe haven't gone the way I wanted them to go, and of course God always worked it out. I couldn't see it at the time, but God always worked it out, right? And he always works it out to the will of God if we let him, right? Now we can be stiff-necked, we can be hard-headed, or we can be servants of God and let him guide our lives. Let him take any circumstances that we're in and turn them to the glory of God. I remember one more story where somebody was in bad circumstances, but they turned it out to the glory of God. Queen Esther, right? She didn't want to be one of the many wives or girlfriends of the king. That's not who she was. But God put her there so that she could protect all the Jewish people. Remember, she was Jewish, right? And that evil man was going to try and kill all the Jewish people. And Esther went to the king and said, please don't destroy my people, right? So God turned the circumstance into glory for him because Esther let Jesus lead her. Isn't that wonderful? I hope you guys have a great week. I figure school is ending right about now for everybody. I hope you have a great long summer, and I hope everybody stays safe. Bye, guys.